Jonathan Ray, and I'm going to be conducting an interview with
Benjamin F. Roberts, his grandfather, who was a World War II veteran.
We'll start off, give us a little peek behind the curtain here of where you were born and when.
I was born in Flint, Michigan on July 18th, 1923.
What was it like growing up in Flint, Michigan?
Great. I really liked that town. General Motors and moved out and kind of ruined it, but it was a great town to grow up in. We had the Mott Foundation that opened up all the schools every summer. In the wintertime, we had places to go. They had classes. They had gym. It was just a great program sponsored by the Mott Foundation. And I really enjoyed it.
What about your family, your mother and father?
I had a great dad. I'm very sorry that I didn't do more to find out his background, but he was a great man. He was a coal miner in Wales, and when the World War II broke out, he went away in 1913, and this really happened. He's a coal miner, and the strict structure of the British Army is they never made a coal miner an officer. But he was in there a little over a year. They made him a first lieutenant, and he was in some of the major battles, wounded several times, but his courage, you just can't imagine how great it was. And when he came home, he kept that courage with him. If anybody messed around, his motto was attack, attack, attack. That was just born in him and was impressed upon him by the British Army, and he kept it all his life and was just a great man. And he went to work for the Buick Motor Company as a machine repairman and spent 35 years with them, supported his family just great, was a master mason, was a 32nd Mason, and he just had an exemplary life. And then my mother and him were just together all that time. And then in 1957, he retired from Buick and did all the things around his house that could be fixed. And he was still restless, so he bought a beer and wine takeout. And this one night, on a Monday night, he's listening to the Detroit Tigers ball game, and a young punk walked in there, 20 years old, and tried to rob my dad. And when he was marching my dad to the freezer to put him in there, my dad's attack mode took over, and he jumped that young kid who had a sawed-off shotgun with a hair trigger, and it shot him right in the belly. And my dad lived 2 days after that. And it was just a terrible time, terrible thing to go through, but it was because of the ingrained attack mode that he always carried with him that cost him his life. And I regret that I didn't get more information of his life. My kids are doing a little better than I did, but I didn't do a good job at all. And my mother, she supported him all through her life and lived till she was 90 years old and did a great job with helping my sister who had 3 kids, and she had to raise them by herself because her husband died when he was about 30 years old, left her with 3 kids. One was only 6 months old. So my mother had to help my daughter my sister an awful lot. And she did that right up until the time she went into a nursing home at about 88 years old and was in there 2 years and then passed away. And she was such a help to my sister that my sister just went downhill after that and passed away 2 years later. But it was a trying time for that family then. And I wasn't much of a support because I was down here in Alabama. I was transferred by Saginaw Steering Gear in 1975 to Alabama. And of course, being so far away, I wasn't any help to my mother and my sister because of that distance. But in the meantime, I had a good life here in Alabama. I worked for Saginaw Steering Gear till I retired in 1980. But I still wasn't really ready to hang it up. So I went to work for Mach and Merriweather out of Cleveland, Ohio, that had a satellite office in Atlanta. And I would go over to Atlanta about once a month to go get meetings, to go to meetings. And in the meantime, when I was around Decatur, I was a machine tool salesman covering northern Alabama and part of Tennessee, and did pretty good at that job too. And then I just retired completely.
Switching gears a little bit, rewinding just a little bit here. Growing up in Flint, Michigan, where did you go to school at?
I went to school. I started out in Washington Elementary School, was only there a year, and we moved over a little further over on the east side. And then I went to Homedale, and went in 1935, I moved over to Lowell Junior High School and graduated from there in 1939. And then I went to Flint Central and graduated in 1941. And at that time, I got a co-op with Buick Motor Company and worked as a co-op student there, and they sent me to GMI, and I just got started into that, and then I enlisted in the United States Army Air Forces.
So where were you when you heard the news about the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor? Do you remember where you were in that moment?
No, I don't. I really don't remember that. We picked it up on the radio as soon as it happened, but where I was when that attack happened, I assumed that I was getting ready for church because it happened on a Sunday morning.
How did you react to hearing that news? How did that make you feel?
Well, it didn't really set in at first. I didn't really recognize what a disaster it was for the United States. But as the war started to get more involved and we started to get involved in Europe, I thought, boy, I've got to do something about this. And so in September of 1942, I decided I better enlist. I really wanted to fly if I could, so I enlisted in the Army Air Forces in September of 1942.
What was your military training? Like, what was your specialty?
I was a radio operator, top ball turret gunner.
Where did you train at? What bases were you stationed at?
Well, I went from Flint to Fort Custer in Michigan, and we got some orientation there. I was there about 3 weeks. And they shipped me to Keesler Field, Mississippi, and it in Keesler Field, we took a lot of testing and trying to decide what is our best MO. And they decided I would make a pretty good radio operator. I wasn't sure about that. But anyway, that's what they decided, and they shipped me up to Chicago. And I was there about 24 weeks, taking mechanics inside the hotel, and then we marched about a mile up to the Coliseum to take code, and I finished up in March of 1943 and was shipped down to Tyndall Field in Florida for gunnery school, and spent about 8 weeks in Tyndall Field, Florida, and then was shipped out to Spokane, Washington, where I joined my crew on a B-17 as a ball turret gunner.
When did they decide to make the switch from a radio operator to putting you in the ball?
Well, when I got to Spokane, they had filled their crew and had done a couple of practice missions, but they lacked a assistant radio operator and ball turret gunner. That was the only position they needed, and so they already had a radio operator, and they needed a ball turret and an assistant radio operator, so that's the position I filled.
You had mentioned Chicago. What was Chicago like for an enlisted man in 1942?
It's the greatest city that they ever had in World War II. I really, really enjoyed my time there. The people were just great. You couldn't hardly buy anything there. You got free transportation all over the city. If you went in and had to have a drink, you couldn't buy a drink. Everybody was just great to you. They had free bowling. They opened up a bowling alley there. There was about 4 floors of bowling, and we could bowl there free. It was just great.
So from Washington, you met up with your crew and got your plane. Tell me about your journey getting from Washington and eventually ending up in England.
Well, when we were in Spokane, we made cross-country trips to get the navigator familiar with going to a specific destination, and the other crew getting familiar working with everybody, the pilot and the co-pilot. The bombardier didn't make any runs right then, but we did that for about 2 or 3 weeks at Spokane, and then we moved down to Walla Walla, Washington, and then our main training really started. We started going on bomb runs. The bombardier started practicing his mission, and the gunners had air-to-air targets out over the Pacific. We were firing at that target. We also had a air-to-ground range where the B-17 made passes at the ground, and we did our firing at different targets there. And we did that for about 4 weeks. And then we moved down to Portland, Oregon, and picked up our plane and did a few more cross-country runs. And then we shipped out to Grand Island, Nebraska, where each crew member was provided with all his flight gear that he was going to need on that bombing missions in the future. We just got ourselves prepared to go overseas, mostly just getting our equipment. And then we started out from Grand Rapids. We were supposed to go to Goose Pond, Canada, but as soon as we got into the air, we ran into bad weather, so we had to sit down at Terre Haute, Indiana, and when we landed awful heavy, and the pilot thought we had probably damaged the landing gear, so we turned the plane over to the engineering group at Terre Haute, and so that gave us about 3 days of furlough, waiting for the plane to be examined and possibly repaired. It turned out that there was no damage, so they just did whatever needed to be done to the gears at that time, and we took off again for Canada. We got to Goose Bay, stayed overnight, and then we went to Newfoundland, stayed overnight there. From Newfoundland, we went to Greenland, stayed overnight in Greenland, took off the next day to Iceland, spent overnight there, and then made our final leg into Scotland, Prestwick, Scotland. When we got to Prestwick, Scotland, our assignment was the 305th Bomb Group, so we took off for Shelveston, England, and landed there that same day, and were assigned to the 305th Bomb Group, 364th Squadron, and they prepared us for our future missions.
Rewinding a little bit there, you had mentioned before to me that Germany was doing something to your radars on the way over. Tell us about that.
Well, when we were flying over to the different places like Greenland and Iceland, we were right down on the deck, about 500 feet above the water, so that the navigator could look at the tops of the waves if he couldn't see the stars or didn't have anything to sight on. He could sight on the tips of the waves out of the ocean. But as we made our way across the ocean, you always had in the back of your mind, and so did the navigator, that there could be some distractions coming out of Germany, some radar interference, and also some radio beams to try to fool him of what our course should be. But we did have a very good navigator. He paid no attention other than what his job was, and he took us right to Prestwick, Scotland.
On your journey over there, you'd mentioned to me before that you lost a crew member during the journey over there by going AWOL. Do you remember his name? And
well, when we left Oregon to go to Grand Rapids to get our final equipment to go overseas, we had a tail gunner there that we had served with for 3 months while we were in training. And when we got to Nebraska, he decided he didn't want to do that. He didn't want to go overseas. He just went AWOL. So they assigned Dominic Laporte to us as a new tail gunner, and he flew out of Nebraska with us to go overseas.
Chat me up a little bit about each of the crew members. I'm gonna give you a crew member's name, and whatever you can recall about the person, do so. Just as a soundbite, as brief as you want to do it, or as long as you want to do it. Dennis McDarby, the pilot.
Well, Dennis was really a great pilot. He was a big man. He was about 6'5", and he had hands that could stretch across all of them throttles And when he had his hands on them throttles, it was a real confidence to watch him fly that airplane. The only problem is when we got done flying our missions in Spokane, practice missions, and we're going to go over to Walla Walla, he got the mumps. And he was in the hospital for about 2 weeks. And of course, we couldn't fly until he come out of the hospital and felt good. And then when he did get cleared to fly, we all took off, and we had a pilot then that was going to check out McDarby and see whether he was capable of flying or whatever. And I can remember being in the nose and him McDarby making his first landing after being laid up for 3 weeks. And it was terrible. We hit the ground and bounded about 20 feet in the air, then hit the ground again and bounded again. And finally the check pilot took over and off we went. We did that 5 or 6 times in a row, and he could not get that airplane down. So finally the check pilot put it down. And then after that, the pilot got a little more confidence and took 2 or 3 more check rides, and then he straightened out and could fly again, and we resumed our practice rounds.
Tell me a little bit about Donald Breeden, the co-pilot.
Well, Donald was a real quiet guy, but his problem was he didn't like bombers. He wanted to be a fighter pilot. And every time McDarby turned a plane over to him, he flew that B-17 like it was a fighter. He'd dive at the ground and pull it up and make steep turns and make you sit right back in your seat. You could hardly move. But that's the kind of pilot he wanted to be.
William Martin, the navigator.
A real nice guy. I really liked him. He was from Chicago, so that's probably why I liked him so much. But he was very nice, and him and I chummed around a little bit and got along real good. And he was a very good navigator.
Harvey Manley, the bombardier.
Harvey was quite a guy. He was out of Texas, and him and I and Bob Wells went partying one night. Well, we really was with the rest of the crew, but Wells and McDarby and Wells and Manley really partied a little bit higher, and then we had to come back to the base, and McDarby drove us back to the base, but because we were already AWOL, we couldn't go in the main gate, so he just left us off and said, make your own way. So Manley and I and Bob walked up the fence line till we thought we found a place where we could get through, and we had an awful time getting Manley through that fence. I think we got a lot of scars on his body trying to throw him through there. And then we finally found his barracks, and the officers in that barracks didn't like us very much, but we enjoyed ourselves.
So that was Manley. Jose Crawford, the radio operator.
Well, Jose was from Indiana, and he kept to himself. He didn't mix too much with anybody, but he was a real good radio operator. And but like I say, I never associated with him too much, and he didn't associate with anybody else on the crew too much.
Leonard Henlon, left turret gunner.
Henlon was
left waist gunner.
Was a waist gunner, but he was also the assistant engineer to Bob Watt, or to Watts, who was the top turret gunner. And they were good friends, and wherever Watts went, Henlin went with him. They were just like twins, and they got along great. I think they were from the same area out in the New Jersey area, and they were real good friends.
Well, we'll touch on what came of Watts in a minute. But can you tell a little bit about Watts, the original top turret gunner?
Well, Watts was the oldest man on the crew. He was 32 years old, and everybody wondered why he would want to do that, but he wanted to do his share, and he was really a capable top turret gunner and an engineer for the crew, and he did everything that was assigned to him. He did like he was 20 years old.
Dominic Lepore, the tail gunner.
Well, we really didn't get to know Dominic too much. We picked him up in Nebraska. We flew to Shelveston, England, and then we started our missions, and we were always busy and never really got acquainted. I didn't get acquainted with it, and I'm not sure anybody on the crew really got acquainted with Dominic before we got shot down.
Robert or Bob Wells.
Bob Wells was a waist gunner and armor, and he was a real good friend of mine. We got along good. We did a lot of things together. He liked to play ball, and him and I would get into any softball game that we could find, or football game when we were traveling from the West Coast to the East Coast and on over to Shelveston. Anytime we stopped and there was a ball game going, him and I would play. And we were real good friends. I liked Bob a lot.
Art Linrod, the top turret gunner.
Well, Linrod, he wasn't with us in all the time we spent in the training in the United States. He joined us when we lost Watts on our first mission. We kind of messed up on that mission, and so we were then put in kind of a training mode while we selected another top gunner or engineer. And we had two guys trying. Art Linwood was one of them, and I don't remember the other guy, but after about 2 weeks of flying across England and making training missions, we selected Art Linwood, and he did a very good job on the next 4 missions.
Okay, so you've gotten your crew, you've gotten your plane, you've made it to Shelveston, England. What were your living quarters like there in Shelveston?
Well, it was what they call some kind of a metal hut, like it was just a half moon, like that went from one side to another in a complete half circle, and there was about 3 crews to a building, and really all you did was sleep, get up, go on a mission, come back, eat, sleep, go on a mission and come back, unless the weather was bad. And then when the weather was bad, we usually went over to the rec room and played cards or whatever you wanted to do. I played a lot of chess with one of the guys that we were checking out to be an engineer on our plane. I called him Shorty because he was a little shorter than I was. And so Shorty and I played a lot of chess when the weather was bad.
So chess is something you did for recreation around there when you had time. Anything else you did for recreation?
We didn't have time. We ate, we slept, played some chess, went on a mission, ate, slept, went on a mission, or played some chess. We really didn't have. We were scheduled to go to London the weekend that we went to Schweinfurt, but because we messed up so bad on our first mission, they scrubbed it and didn't let our crew go. So we had no really time to ourselves. Like every 2 or 3 weeks, some crew went into London. We never got that privilege.
Were you married at the time you enlisted?
No, I wasn't. I married when I come home.
How did you feel? Mail is a big part of a enlisted man's life. How did you feel about getting censored mail?
Well, I wasn't in England long enough to get much mail. I really don't remember getting hardly any mail in England. So I didn't really relate to censorship. I wrote some letters, and I assume I got some letters, but I was only there the latter part of August, September, and went down in October. So because of the slowness of the mail and that, I got very little, if I got any. I might not have even got any.
Were you able to follow or keep up with the news about the war while this was going on? If you did, how so?
No, really, like I say, we were busy sleeping, missions, chest or something like that, or eating. I do remember when the Americans went into Italy, and Italy finally surrendered in September of 1943, and I remember that part of it, and I thought, oh, we must be doing pretty good. But to keep up, I didn't have any idea what they were doing over in the Pacific.
Aside from being grounded for that about a month period, how many days typically were between your other missions?
Some days we went every day. We went to Cologne on the 7th, to Brennan on the 8th, Gdynia on the 9th, and then we didn't fly again till the 14th.
Give me a little insight to how your equipment worked.
Well, the worst part was the darn oxygen mask. I mean, it was 40 degrees below zero up there, and to keep that thing from freezing up and that was a real job and a real concern, because you had to have oxygen. My problem was to keep warm, because you didn't have any heat in that ball turret. And in fact, on my last mission, my heated boots shorted out, and I was really getting frostbite real bad. And I think if I had completed that mission, I would have had to have had my legs amputated. They'd have been froze solid.
What about the turret guns?
I had no trouble with my turret guns. The armors took care of it when we got back from our missions. They were ready to go when I got on the plane that day, that we were scheduled, and they worked good when I was in the air, and I had no problem at all.
What about the chatter amongst the plane on the radio from man to man? Were you a part of that?
Yeah, especially on that first mission. We didn't have our bombardier with us, and they didn't know the navigator didn't know how to open them bomb bay doors, so he had to talk with the armorer, Bob Wells, back at the waist, who tried to tell him how to open them doors, and the pilot was getting all upset because he had to be prepared to drop them bombs and get turned around and coming back, and he was so involved in the conversations that he forgot to try to transfer the gas from the main tanks to the wing tanks, and then he had to send Watts out to do that while them bomb bay doors were still open, and that was a disaster. And Watts ran out of oxygen in the walk-along bottle and passed out right over the bomb bay, and the radio operator got him into the radio room, and he was so frostbitten that he just couldn't survive. He lost all his fingers on both hands and part of his ears, and we never saw him again.
So that was your first mission to Frankfurt there.
Yes.
So is that the first time that you ever fired a gun in anger that you could remember?
Yeah, it was, definitely. But I don't recognize it as being anger. It was kind of just like a job and a little bit of fun. I mean, I see an airplane coming at me, and I knew he was the enemy. You don't think of anger or anything like that. You just start shooting back.
So we were talking briefly about the equipment and how it worked. Do you think that the enemy's equipment was superior in any way to your equipment?
No, but them German pilots were good and they were smart. When we first started flying there, not necessarily our group, but the whole 8th Air Force, when they first started going over there, the Germans attacked from the rear. And we really held our own then. And so they finally got smart and turned around and come in from the front, because we didn't have the turrets in the front protecting us like we had in the tail. And they would come diving through from the front and be right through the whole formation in a matter of seconds. And they were going like a dive bomber, and then they'd sweep around and come back in from the nose again, and it was really difficult to get a good shot at them. They were going through there so fast. And then at other times, they would sit out there at about 1,200 yards and lob them little 20 millimeter shells into us, and we couldn't reach them with our guns. And that put a lot of holes in our airplanes.
We've talked a lot about the first mission here. Was anybody besides the top turret gunner that you mentioned?
Besides Wells, and he really wasn't hurt by the enemy. He was hurt because we had made a mistake and didn't transfer the gas at the right time. Plus, we didn't have a bombardier with us, so we couldn't get the doors open. Then we couldn't get them closed, and that made us fall back from our group. And so we're flying back to England all by ourselves, and everybody's just busy firing.
Watts was the only one injured. On the way back, did you pull him into the radio room or up into the nose?
Into the radio room. You couldn't get him into the nose very easy. That was a pretty crowded hole to go down through to get into the nose.
What were the conditions like on that airplane?
Cold.
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 On the way to your target or on the way back, did you ever eat while on the airplane?
Eat?
Yeah.
No.
No.
You didn't have time to eat, and you had to keep your eyes open. The only time we ate on that bomber was when we were in training. They used to give us peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and they would get cold because of the cold weather outside, and they tasted good, but we didn't take them on missions with us.
So your airplane, it was an early model, as you mentioned.
It had no nose turret, chin turret, and that was a kind of a handicap. But I never flew in a plane that had the chin turret, so I don't know how effective that was either.
Did your plane have a name?
Well, I hate to mention this, but we had a borrowed plane on that first mission, and it was called the Uncouth Bastard. The rest of the plane was our regular plane, and we hadn't named it yet.
Did your regular plane have any artwork painted up on it?
No, not yet. Like I say, we only put 4 missions on that thing, and most of it was in between when we first got our plane. When we came in from Scotland to the 305th Bomb Group, the Shelveston ground crew took over our plane to prepare it for missions, so it wasn't ready for our first mission, but it was for our second and third and fourth mission.
Did you wear a decorated A2 jacket?
No, I had an A2, but I didn't. It wasn't decorated, and I don't know what happened to it. I wished I'd have kept it in better shape.
So, shifting now to your next mission to Cologne. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, that wasn't so bad. On the Cologne, Michigan mission, we had moved up into the center of the group, and so we were protected by more B-17s than we were on our first mission, where we were tail end Charlie. So we had a pretty good run that time, but just as we were getting to the coast, we were jumped by about 9 109s, and everybody was fired on them. But I got a good shot at one, and I really laid it into him, and I followed him all the way down to the water. And when we got back to briefing, I didn't mention it, but Wells and Hemlin said, "Hey, you shot a plane down there that you should get credit for." And I said, "Well, I didn't know that for sure." And they said, "Yes, you did." And then finally some other crews that were flying in the same formation said, "Yes, I knocked him right down." So they put me in for the air medal for that airplane, even though other guys got planes. There was more firepower from other gunners on them same planes, so you never knew who hit them. But mine was almost one-on-one.
You were grounded after that first mission for a month. So you were running some pretty continuous training missions between your first and second mission. Did you ever get a chance to mingle with the locals around Shelveston?
We never got off the base. Like I say, we got there the last of August, and we're a lot of orientation meetings when you first get there. And I did have time to get me a bicycle, because that's the way you got around. And I got a bicycle, but I never got to ride out the gate and go over to the little towns. I can't even remember the names, but they had a couple of small villages outside of the base, and they had bars in them that a lot of the crews went to. But we never got there because we were there such a short time before we got shot down.
Tell me a little bit about your... before we get to that, you mentioned a term that's a little inside, I think. Tail end Charlie. What does that mean?
Well, tail end Charlie is you're flying low group. In the wing, your group is the last group down low, and they go on up in layers. You got the lead group is up high, and then they're filled in between, and the last group down at the bottom is all by himself, you might say, because there's nobody underneath him. And then you might be the last plane in your squadron, and that makes you the very last plane, and that's called tail end Charlie.
right, so chat me up a little bit about your third mission to Bremen.
Well, that wasn't nothing to really talk about. We did a lot of shooting and a lot of flak on that mission. Brennan had a lot of anti-aircraft gunners, and they really loaded the area over the target with a lot of flak. And you could, like I say, get out and walk on it. At least it seemed like it. And that flak could really take its toll if it got into your plane, because it just rattled around and was like a shrapnel going every place. But other than that, and a lot of shooting, we had a pretty good mission.
Okay. Tell me a little bit about now your fourth mission, or a town that it's not its original name.
Gdynia.
What was that?
One thing I can remember about Gdynia was an awful long way. It seemed like we were in that airplane forever, but we didn't run into a lot of opposition. I think it was the route that we took. We went way up around Germany, you might say, and come into Gdynia from kind of like the northwest, and we didn't have a lot of opposition, except the thing that made that mission so difficult was the length of time you had to fight all the way there and all the way back. It seemed like forever.
Well, what's the name of that town?
Gdynia.
Its current name.
Kiel.
Kiel. And your final mission here.
Yeah.
The trip to Schweinfurt.
Yeah, Schweinfurt was something else. When we took off, it was really, really foggy, and so trying to form after we got into the air was a very difficult job. We finally got our 16, got to our embarkation point where we were supposed to join the rest of the groups, but they weren't there. But we could see them off about 20 miles to our northwest, so we went towards them diagonally, hoping that we could join some part of the wing there. We saw an opening, but we had to turn 16 planes into a group of hundreds of planes. And when you're turning like that, you're going a lot slower than the planes that are going straight. And we could never catch up to our wings that was crossing the channel. And so when we crossed the channel, we were 16 planes all by ourselves. And when the Germans come up to meet us, it was like they were shooting ducks. It was just a massacre because we didn't have any support.
Talk to me for just a moment about what it's like when you see that briefing early in the morning deep into the heart of Germany, and what the morale is inside that barracks.
Well, they get you up about 4 o'clock in the morning, and it's pretty darn cold in October in England, and so you're really busting around trying to get clothes on and get over to breakfast. And they usually had a pretty good breakfast, especially if it was going to be a long mission. They fed us good, and we went to breakfast and maybe spend a half hour there or so, and then we would go to briefing and sit there. And when you get into briefing, you'd be sitting there waiting, because they had on the stage, they would have your target for that day, but it would be all covered with a big sheet. And so you're sitting there thinking, I wonder where it'll be today, what our mission will be. And then when the briefing officer would come up on the stage and pull that sheet back, and they would say, Schweinfurt, everybody went, oh, because they knew it was going to be rough. And that was more the kind of the attitude in all the briefings, really.
So, getting back up to speed, there it is. It's the second trip to Schweinfurt now, Black Thursday. You've come across the channel, you're deep into Europe, you're flying over, you're almost to the German border. What happens now? They've seen the mishap in your formation. They're all over you. What happens next?
Man, it's just airplanes buzzing around like flies, and you don't even know who to shoot at. They're coming so fast. And first thing that hit us is somebody come in from up at the front, and he knocked out 2 engines. And the pilot decided right away that we've had it. And so he pushed the bailout button right then, and he started down from the cockpit, and Breeden started with him, and so did Linwood. And this is all secondhand. Linwood's the one that told me this. When they came down through the opening, Breeden was walking the Bombay doors, and Linwood said, "Are you coming?" And he said, "Yep." And so the pilot had already gone out. He was the first one out, and Linwood was going to follow him. And when he went through the nose, he asked Manley and Martin, "Are you ready?" And they said, "We're going to come right behind you." So Linwood got out, and that's the last he talked to them. And then when you come from the front of the plane to the back of the plane, I'm in that ball turret, and I can see we're in a big dive, and I wonder if I was going to get help to get out of the turret. And I put it into park, and then pretty soon Bob Wells come over and cranked me out, and we started putting my harness on, and the radio operator had just jumped. Laporte had already got out. Henlon was sitting there. He was already dead with a 30 millimeter in the middle of his forehead. And when Wells was trying to help me to get my harness buckled under my legs, we got straight from the tail, and it shoved me towards the radio room. And I didn't know what happened to Wells, because at that time the wings and everything come off, and it was just the plane fuselage from the radio room back floating around like a feather. But there was so much debris and crap in the air, you couldn't see nothing. You couldn't see the door to get out or anything, but I crawled on my hands and knees to the area I knew the door was at, and wondered where Bob was. Couldn't see him. I got to the door and jumped, and I said, "Uh-oh," because the tail swung around. It hit me in the head, and as far as I know, it knocked me right out, because next thing I know, I'm talking to myself. Got my hand on the handle that you carry your chest pack with, and I said to myself, "That don't work." And I put it over on the red handle and pulled it, and I swung down, and that harness went up and pushed my arms way up. I thought I was going to fall out of my chute, and I'm on the ground. And I thought, holy mackerel. I look up, and 20 feet, maybe 30 feet in front of me is that fuselage, sitting there all like a big cigar, with a tail sitting there just like it was ready to go, except there was no wings, no nose, no nothing, just that. And so I thought, I got to see what happened to Bob. And I walked over there, even though I could hardly walk because of a frostbite. My legs, my feet were just really, really frozen. And I got over and looked into the waist door, and Wells was just laying back there at the tail wheel with his chute open way back through the tail. And I didn't know why he didn't get out. And then I walked around the rest of the plane, couldn't see anything else. And then I find out later that Wells had just been probably crushed from the crash. They say a lot of his bones and that were all broken up. But I kind of think he might have got, when that plane strafed us, that he got shot in the back and couldn't get out. And I really felt terrible, because if he hadn't stopped to help me, he could have definitely been out of that plane long ago and been alive today. It makes you think twice of why you and not him, and you just don't know what life's got to give you in situations like that. And I was one of the fortunate, blessed ones.
So you'd never had time to get your leg straps in there. You almost came out of the chute.
Yes.
You're on the ground. All your training up to that point had told you to get your chute, bury it, give it to a local, something like that, and get out of there. But you had to go and check on your friend Robert Wells.
Yes.
So during all this, some guards were coming from.
Well, see, I landed with one foot in a creek and the other foot on land. And I look across that creek, and there's a guy standing there looking right at me. And because that chute had almost come off, I didn't have to get out of it or nothing. I just had to pull my arms back in, and I was out of that chute. I thought, well, you can have it. And that's when I walked from that creek to that airplane. And while I'm walking around that airplane, I look up, and the guards are coming down from a coal mine that was about a mile away. But by that time, it was too late for me to do anything.
So the guards meet up with you. What do they say?
For you, the war is over.
So the guards take you. How were you treated initially by those guards?
I was treated all right. The civilians were a little bit belligerent, but it was a pretty small town, so there wasn't an awful lot of them, and it was more in the Belgium, which was more favorable than if it would have been Germany. And so they just took me to the jail. When I got to the jail, McDarby and Linwood and Jose, the radio operator, were there, and they just held us there overnight. In some way, I don't know how we got separated, but I was by myself with one guard, and I don't know what happened to Linwood, and McDarby, and Jose. They were just gone. And the guard then took me and put me on a train with him. We went up to Amsterdam, and then got on another train and come back down to Frankfurt. And wow, that was a tough 2 weeks at Frankfurt.
Yeah, you had just bombed Frankfurt 2 months ago, right? So they weren't too happy with you.
Yeah.
They gave you some interrogation. How long did that go on?
2 weeks.
2 weeks.
And it was two of the toughest weeks I ever spent, I think. They threw all kinds of threats at you, scared the devil right out of you, and really they knew just about everything anyway, but because we had just started throwing the shaft out of the plane, which was long slivers of tinfoil, and as that left the plane, it went round and round, and it fooled the gunners that was on the ground. They didn't know what altitude we were at. And the Germans were really wanted any information they could find on that. And so maybe the interrogation was tougher, and maybe it wasn't. I don't know, but it was tough. And then when that was over, they put us in a boxcar that we called the 40 and 8. You could put 8 horses in there or 40 men. We had about 60 or 70 in there. And that night, the English come over to bomb them marshalling yards. Fortunately, the English couldn't hit nothing, and we made it out of there.
So from there, where do you end up?
Krems, Austria, Stalag 17B.
What was the treatment like there in the POW camp?
Well, they didn't have any food, so they couldn't give us any food. But fortunately, we had the American Red Cross, and they saved our life. They got us parcels whenever they could, which was usually about a parcel every 2 weeks or something like that you had to split with another person. It was half a parcel apiece. And you had Linwood and I were a combine. Some guys had 4 or 5 guys in their combine, but Linwood and I were a combine for 19 months, and we never had an argument. It was just great the way him and I got along.
Were any other crew members there besides Art?
Yeah, Jose was on the bunk below me, and let's see, Laporte was down the other end of the building, so I didn't see him. I don't think I saw him all the time we were there. He was down there. So there was me, Linwood, Jose. 3. Oh, yeah. There was only 4 of us. McDarby was in another camp.
Because he was an officer?
Yeah.
What was the relationship like between you and the guards there?
Not too bad. Them guards were the Luftwaffe, so they respected other flyers, and they could speak perfect English. Our guard had spent several years in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So he got along with us pretty good.
Wow. How long were you there at the camp?
19 months.
What did you do for recreation there?
Oh, I walked the compound out there, tried to stay in as good a shape as I could, and played a lot of bridge, played some poker until I decided, hey, that's not the way to do it. You're gambling away your food, and I wanted my food, so I quit that. But the rest of the time, especially in wintertime, you're in the sack trying to keep warm.
How were you able to obtain any news about the war? And if so, how were you doing that?
Well, we had lots of radios in that town. There was a lot of guys that could speak German, and they used cigarettes to barter with other Germans. And so we got radio parts and had radios all over the place. And in fact, them radios was getting us in trouble because they were always putting us out in a compound and making us stand out there while they searched the camp for radios. But every night we had a guy coming from different barracks about 8:30 and would give us the news of where the Americans were at that particular time. So we had probably as up-to-date map as Eisenhower.
So he would run from barracks to barracks delivering the news, a lot like on that movie. Yeah. What was day-to-day life like in that camp? Was there?
They were all very, very similar. The first thing you woke up with, roust with you, roust with you. The Germans would come in and roust everybody out for roll call out to the compound. And naturally, we were trying to make a nuisance of ourselves, and we would drag our butts until they'd put their bayonets on their rifles and say, roust with you, and jab you in the ass if you didn't move.
So you did 2 years there, nearly. How did this all come to an end?
Well, in about March of 1945, the Russians were getting pretty close to Vienna, and the Americans were very close to wrapping up everything on the western side of Germany. And so our guards and the camp commander and all that didn't want to give himself up to the Russians, so he decided to move us. So they broke us up into 500 men groups and started marching us west towards the Americans. And we would make anywhere from 20 to 25 miles a day, supposedly going to get food when we got to different spots, but that never happened. They didn't have any facilities for something like that, and so we kind of scrounged around on farmyards when we were walking, and like I say, the guards were, the younger ones were gone. They weren't going to stick around. We had some guys that probably were in their 60s guarding us, and they weren't any guard at all. And so we were more or less on our own, and they were just guiding us to where we were going to be liberated, you might say. And we marched till we got to Braunau on the Inn River, and they put us in this big, I call it a forest. It was probably only a woods, and we made camp there. And we could hear the Americans across the Inn River, but we had no way of contacting them. But one guy in the camp was a pretty good swimmer, and he volunteered to swim that Inn River and contact the Americans. And he did that, and it was very fortunate for us because they were about ready to bomb, shell that woods because they thought we were Germans in there. And when he contacted them, they weren't quite sure that he was right or not, but they built a pontoon bridge across that Inn River, and then they come in with that tanks all buttoned up, coming into that wooded area. And when they actually see they were American GI prisoner of war, they popped them tanks up, and it was the greatest sight and celebration you ever saw.
What's the ironic historic significance about Braunau?
About what?
The town you were liberated in.
Hitler was born there.
So you mentioned how great that feeling was there when you were liberated, when the GIs came across that pontoon bridge. Where did you go from there?
Well, they put us in an aluminum factory, and we were in that factory waiting for a more positive bridge across that Inn River so that they could bring trucks back and forth. And the idea behind that was the airport that we were going to fly out of was on the other side of the river. So they kept us in that aluminum plant for about 4 or 5 days while they built a big substantial bridge that trucks could cross back and forth. And when that happened, they took us to an airport and flew us into Camp Lucky Strike in France.
How long were you at Camp Lucky Strike?
Linda and I were there about 2 days, and a plane come in from our group, and we talked to the pilot and talked him into taking us back to the group, 305th Bomb Group in England, and that's what we did. We flew back with them, and when we got there, Linwood wanted to go to London, and I wanted to go see my granddad, which I had planned to do before I got shot down, and so we went our separate ways. I went back to Wales, he went to London, and we were going to meet in London a week later.
What happened?
terrible. I met my granddad and had a great week, but on the way back towards London, I really, really got sick. I was vomiting all over the place and didn't know what was wrong. But when we got to London, I went to the USO to see if Linwood was there, and I couldn't find him. But I told the nurses there I felt terrible. And they examined me and said that they thought I just had some bad booze. And I didn't think that was right. But anyway, they gave me a bunk. And I'm laying there, and the guy in the bunk next to me, he sees how sick I am. I'm getting up and vomiting and feeling terrible. So he says, I'm going down and see if I can do something else. So he went downstairs and come back with a guy that was a medic in World War I. But he was volunteering at this USO. And he kind of examined me and felt my stomach. And he says, I think you got appendicitis. I'd never heard of me ever having any pain or anything like that until I got on that train. But anyway, he called the American authorities, and they brought an ambulance in there. And about an hour later, they were operating on me.
How did you feel when you woke up from the operation?
Great. I really did.
Yeah.
No more vomiting. I was there for a week, and I healed. And they said, don't carry anything very heavy. And I says, okay. And I put that barracks bag on my back and took off.
So you talked about a lot of great feelings, liberation, and how you felt when you woke up. How did you feel about VE Day?
Well, I killed my cat. I got everybody in the car, and I'm driving out of our driveway so fast to get downtown, I run over the cat.
So from England, how did you make it home?
That was VJ Day, not VE.
Oh, okay.
That was VE Day. I was still in Germany.
Right. Oh, okay.
VJ
Right.
Day.
Yeah. How did you get home from England?
Well, after I got out of that hospital, I had to get some money to get to Southampton, because that was where I was supposed to go out of. So I went to the Red Cross, and they gave me £2, and that was enough to give me train fare to go down to Southampton. And when I got down there, they told me that I wouldn't be able to get on a ship until about a week later. I'm not positive how many days it was, but it was about a week. So I says, okay. So I'm up in town at the railroad station wondering what I should do. And I talked to a girl there, and she was a nice-looking girl. And I told her my problem, that I wasn't going to have any place to go for a week and that. She says, well, come on home with me. And she lived in Bournemouth, which was 80 miles east of us, west of us, and it was a nice seaside city. People in England went there for vacations and that. So I rode with her back to Bournemouth, and she lined me up with the IRF, and she was in a kind of a school situation with a lot of other girls, and she put me with a IRF that had a gymnasium, and that's where they were sleeping, was on the floor of that gymnasium. So that's where I stayed for that week, and went to dances and met her parents and her brothers, and had a pretty good week. And then I had to be at Southampton at 8 o'clock this one morning, so I got up about 5:30 and got out on the road by about 6, and pretty soon a motorcycle come along, picked me up, and it was cold, and I couldn't hang on, but I would hang on a little while, and then I'd put my hands in my pocket, and he was driving 80 miles an hour through these little villages. Man, we made it to them 80 miles in about an hour.
Wow.
And I'm there in plenty of time to get on the ship.
What kind of ship did you get on?
An LST, 300 foot long, but it was the best food I ever ate. And I don't even remember what kind of bunk we slept in or anything, but I just remember that there was a great food and that we ran into an awful storm at the Azores. Both screws could come right out of the water. And it was, but it took 17 days. But it was 17 days that I really recuperated and got a lot better than I was when I left.
So where did you port when you got in
Newport News.
Newport News.
Yep, Newport News. And then they put us on a train and took us into Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. And they processed us there and said, hey, you're going home for 75 days. And I said, great. And a guy from Barracks 36 lived in Flint, Michigan, and I visited him in the POW camp a lot of times. We were pretty good friends. In fact, their folks knew my folks, and they visited and kept account of what was happening. And him and I got on the train to go back to Flint, Michigan, and it broke down about Toledo, Ohio. So we had to hitchhike the rest of the way. There was no other way to get there. And we got picked up by an ambulance and got so far. We got picked up by a couple of cars, and finally we made it all the way into Flint.
When did you first see your family when you got home?
When I got home, they weren't home. I didn't get in till about 10 o'clock at night, and there was nobody home at all. And I thought, well, what do I do now? I don't know. They must not lock the doors, or I don't know how, but I know I was inside the house. Nobody was there. And I was there probably half hour or so, and then they drove in. And naturally, that was just great. It was my dad and my mother and my sister. And it was wonderful.
Wonderful. So you made it home.
Mm-hmm.
So you got home. How did you feel when you learned about FDR's death?
I just told you that. We were on a farm in a barn on the march, and we heard that he'd passed away on April the 12th, 1945, and we felt bad, but with our situation, there wasn't anything we could do, so that was it.
When did you first learn about the Nazi concentration camps?
I don't really remember. I mean, I was so interested in getting home, getting married, and getting to work that I didn't pay much attention to what was going on out in the real world. I don't think there was an awful lot put in the papers about it at that time. It was mostly the Nuremberg trials is all they were talking about, convicting all of the Nazis for war crimes. That was the main items in that day. The persecutions were more or less down the line further, like into 57 or 8 or something like that.
What about the atomic bomb, the news of the atomic bomb? When did you hear about that, and how did that make you feel?
I really didn't hear about it. I only heard that the war was over on October the 14th, 1945, and that was great.
So you learned about it much later. How did you view the war while you were involved in the war?
Oh, I thought we were going to win all the time, and it wasn't going to get me. I'd be home no time.
Did your feelings ever change
Never.
to this day?
To this day.
So what did you do after the war was over? When did you get married?
On September the 20th, 1945.
How long had you been home at that point?
2 months.
2 months. What was it like after you came home and adjusting into the world? What was life like after that?
Really, I thought it was just great. I was just got married and I started my job and went on strike for 119 days. No money coming in, but my wife was working, so I didn't care.
So not too long after that, you started a family. When was your first son born?
On October the 21st, 1947, Bill was born, and he had a lot of conjunction on his lungs and that. Boy, we had a tough time with him. One time we even had to give him x-rays to try to drive that stuff out of his lungs. But eventually, by the time he was about 2 years old, he was handling good and we had no more problems. But Mike was a different thing. Man, he couldn't get him filled. My wife didn't know how to handle him. So I had to take a day off to help her out. She went to sleep because she hadn't been getting any sleep. And I took over and I filled him up and put him to sleep. She says, "How'd you do that?" I says, "I just fed him and fed him and fed him."
So with a kid, two kids, one has some lung problems early on, and then another one who won't stop eating. What's it like for two new parents back post-war?
Well, it's kind of different. You haven't been through that before, but it was more tough on my wife than it was on me because she was the one that wasn't getting so much sleep. I was doing all right, and like I say, when I took over, I just kept feeding him until he fell asleep, and she didn't believe in that. She thought he's only supposed to get this much, and that's all she'd give him, and he was still hungry.
And then by the time my mom came along, you guys kind of had it.
Yeah, we knew what to do by then. Yeah.
Right. Tell me a little bit about your experience getting your pilot's license and that after the war.
Well, a friend of mine says, "Hey, we got some more GI Bill. Why don't we try to learn how to fly?" And I said, "Well, I don't care. Let's do it." So we took our physicals, and he flunked his. But I had to do it by myself then. And that's a lot of work to get 50 hours in and work too. I would have to come home from work, get cleaned up, and go clear out to Bishop Airport, which was about 30 miles from where I live, put in my hour, come back home. And do that, and it took me from that spring until about August to get my 50 hours in. And you had to go to ground school and stuff like that, so it was a lot of work, and I was doing it myself. My friend, he flunked. So anyway, when I got my license, I took my wife up when she only had 2 more weeks to go for Bill's birth. Then I took my dad up and took my brothers-in-laws up, and then I kind of quit that because you didn't know what kind of planes you were renting and that, so I just quit doing that. And then one day some friends that I knew at work had an airplane, and he brought it into Bishop Airport, and I said, "Well, let's take my sons up with us." And so I took Mike and Bill over there to the airport, and they weren't up very long, and they got sick. No, they didn't. They got through the flight, But by the time they come home, we're on our front yard, then they got sick. And Bill's been mad at me ever since. He's done everything to try to make me sick. Put me in a boat and did everything and took my snowmobile and did everything, and wherever I would drive, he would wonder if I'd get sick, and never happened. But he was always been mad about that. Mike, he's never liked airports or flying since then. He don't want to fly.
So from Michigan, you made your way down to Alabama to work at the division of the steering gear. Can you tell me a little bit about your time spent there?
Yeah, I enjoyed every bit of it. It was really great. I had some good friends down here, Jack and Herm and a few others that were real close friends, and we were right there on the golf course. We played a lot of golf and played a lot of bridge, made a lot of good friends, and I couldn't ask for it any better. Really couldn't.
Well, I believe that pretty much concludes the interview. Anything else you want to add?
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You did a good job.
Yeah. And how old are you now? It's
96.
96 in 2019. So you're halfway there.
Yeah.
Yeah, 96 more.
No, not 96 more, but I might make it to 100.
Well, all right. Signing off.
All right.